The Trapper is one of the simplest killers in Dead by Daylight, not just in his power, but in his perks as well. His special power of being able to set up bear traps can be very slow and at times quite aggravating, since that's valuable time spent on a payoff that is by no means guaranteed. But oh boy, the satisfaction when someone steps in one of your traps is hard to beat, especially if you chase them into the trap in question. Meanwhile, his perks aren't really anything special, but they are pretty decent. Well, two of them are anyway. Let's discuss them. The Trapper's power is pretty self-explanatory, so much so that I already explained it in the intro. There's not much more to explain about the power itself, so I'll go straight to how you can use it. The most obvious way to use your traps is, of course, blocking pallets in vault locations, as to ensure survivors cannot use them while being chased. However, you should be careful with your placements, as the traps can be quite visible when placed directly in a pallet spot or under a window. Instead, what you should do is try to hide your traps by placing them in tall grass or bushes. Alternatively, certain maps, especially indoor ones, will almost never have consistent lighting across the entire surface area. The result of this, of course, is there being dark spots here and there, and this can absolutely be used to your advantage. If the lighting at a spot is especially poor, you can make use of it to hide your traps in plain sight. At least in theory. I have played some games where I'll set a trap in a spot with pitch black lighting so dark I can't even see the trap myself, only for it to suddenly get disarmed sometime later. This is also something that, like the tall grass, isn't always a tool available to you. Some maps don't always have good enough, or I guess bad enough lighting, which can be quite irritating since it seemed like a perfect spot, but I guess the survivors are part Khajiit or something, for there to be dark spots to use, and indoor maps almost never have tall grass to hide your traps in. I guess what I'm saying is that Trapper pretty much lives and dies by the map you play on. Granted, to a certain point, this is true of most killers, but when your entire power is placing traps and hoping survivors won't spot them, you really need a good map to consistently do well. And all of that is without even mentioning the fact that survivors can just disarm your traps. Yes, if a survivor spots your traps, they can just disarm them and shatter all your hopes and dreams, as well as nullify the time spent setting them up, meaning you need to go and reset it. Okay, that's being a little dramatic, but it is pretty annoying. I've also noticed that maps don't always seem to have consistent lighting between matches, and seem to operate on a range of brightness, though that could just be my imagination. Anyways, if someone disarms one of your traps, you will at least get a loud noise notification, so the survivor is essentially broadcasting their location when they counter your power. And it gives your traps a small degree of information gathering potential, which can be helpful, especially in maps that are lacking in good trap spots. Unfortunately, I'd say the traps are not super great as powers go, but they can be pretty nice when they work. They are pretty frustrating if you aren't using add-ons, however. Now that I've said all that, let's get into the perks that Trapper brings to the table. The first perk that Trapper comes with is Agitation, which increases the speed at which you move while carrying a survivor. For a long time, I actually thought that picking up survivors had no impact on speed, and that this perk made you move faster than normal while carrying someone, which would have been pretty cool, but that is very much not the case. Instead, this perk mainly serves the purpose of counteracting the speed penalty that comes from carrying a survivor, which of course buys you more time to get to a hook. This is especially helpful for those times when someone sabotages the hook you are heading towards, or for when people are body blocking you. Naturally, if you want this perk to reach its full potential, you should combine this with Iron Grasp and Mad Grit from the Legion if you have access to it. Personally, I would say you only ever really need one of these perks, but if you tend to encounter a lot of opposition while transporting a victim, then stacking multiple transportation perks might be a good idea. As far as equipping only one of them goes, I'd recommend Iron Grasp over this one. The Trapper's second perk, Brutal Strength, is one of the simplest perks in the game, just like Agitation is, come to think of it. Brutal Strength increases the speed at which you break things by 20%, meaning pallets won't slow you down quite as much as they normally would, and you can smash walls and generators a fair bit faster as well. There isn't really much else to say about this. It's a solid perk, and if you combine it with Enduring from the Hillbilly and Fire Up from the Nightmare, you can nullify pallets as a problem pretty effectively. The Trapper's final perk is the most unique of the bunch, but is unfortunately also the least useful. Unnerving Presence applies two debuffs to survivors who happen to be within your terror radius. Firstly, they will experience 10% more skill checks, and secondly, the success zones of those skill checks are decreased by 60%. The general idea of this perk, I assume, anyway, is to make skill checks more difficult so the survivors will screw up more often. The problems with this perk are threefold. Number one is that the perk only applies to survivors within your terror radius, which means the effectiveness is pretty limited, though you could get around this by equipping the perk Distressing to increase your terror radius. Number two is the problem with survivors not missing skill checks very often, so the value you get from this is limited at the best of times, and at worst, you get Number Tree. This perk can actually be a boon to some survivors. What I'm referring to with this is that, number one, the great skill check zone is unaffected, and the good zone is the only part that shrinks, which basically means that survivors can actually be more likely to get great skill checks than good ones, which, when combined with the increased frequency of checks, can result in survivors completing generators a little bit faster when unnerved. And that's without mentioning the possible use of perks like Hyperfocus, or even This Is Not Happening, which could potentially exacerbate the issue. The most important thing to keep in mind is that the Trapper is really not the best choice for using this perk. I would recommend combining this with the inherent skill-wrecking power of the Doctor. Especially if you can combine this with Distressing as well as, say, his own Overcharge perk, or maybe Collarphobia from the Clown. Basically, stacking anti-skill check perks in general works best with the Doctor, but I'm getting a little too off topic. Let's wrap this up. And thus the Trapper and his perks. Not terrible by any means, but not terribly interesting either. If nothing else, I'd say that Brutal Strength and Agitation are very solid and can fit nicely as a slot filler in any build if you can't think of anything else to put in that fourth slot. But I want to hear what you think. Is there anything I forgot to mention? Is there more I could have said about Brutal Strength? Feel free to discuss in the comments, but in the meantime I have more work to do. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.